Welcome back to Turpentine VC, a podcast where we discuss the art and science of building successful venture firms, VC to VC. On this episode, I was joined by Seth Bannon. Seth is a co-founder and general partner at 50 Years, a venture capital firm focused on breakthrough science and deep tech startups. We discussed the challenges and opportunities in commercializing academic research and deep tech innovations, the distinction between biotech and tech bio companies, and the implications of today's Biomoment in technology. Since we recorded this conversation in 2023, Seth and the 50 Years team launched manifest grants for synthetic bio and climate solutions. They've also launched 45 companies from their PhD company creation program, 50/50. Let's dive in. Seth, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Erik.
So, Seth, by way of introduction, why don't you introduce 50 Years and talk about the evolution of how it started and how it's evolved to get to where it is today?
Sure, yeah. So I'll just quickly share my background because I think it sort of informs what we're trying to do here. I basically just from a super young age was captivated by the idea of solving the big problems in the world for people who couldn't solve them themselves. I was inspired. I was raised by a single mom and she always used to fight the good fights. And I thought that was pretty cool. Everything from, organizing letter writing campaigns to our congressperson to if she saw someone cutting line at the cafe, she'd be the one that would march over and say, "Excuse me, this person was in front of you," which when you're 10 feels like, your mom's out there crime fighting or something. And then when I was 12, we were living in a house that was heated by propane gas, and there was a leak and a spark, an explosion. And she was unfortunately in the house at the time, and she got tossed up at the ceiling and floor and was left with nerve damage and brain damage and was permanently disabled after that. And so essentially, what would happen is she would see the same injustice she saw before, but wouldn't be able to do what she used to do about it. And so she'd get sad, and so I'd get sad. And so as a good son, I would start doing those things for her. And it cheered her up, cheered me up, problem solved. And then at some point I realized that there were, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people in the world that were in a similar sort of situation and that they were faced with some sort of injustice or problem, but couldn't solve it themselves, either because they're disabled like my mom or because they're kids or just because they come from a socioeconomic background that doesn't equip them with the tools they need. And it was sort of a simultaneously horrifying, but also very exhilarating realization. And I decided right then and there that I wanted to be their proxy, like I was my mom's proxy, and focus on solving big problems for people who couldn't solve them themselves. Started off trying to do that in politics, worked for Obama and a bunch of other people. And then over time became an entrepreneur, got exposed to Silicon Valley and realized that technology entrepreneurship was a far, far better lever for solving all of those problems, in my opinion, than government or in almost all cases, NGOs. And so Silicon Valley is just incredible, high potential, very fast, very high scale place. And I was just intoxicated from the get-go, but a little bit sort of disillusioned with the types of things most people were focusing on. You often meet a brilliant machine learning engineer and ask what they're working on, and it comes down to squeezing a few more fractions of a cent out of an ad impression. And so I got obsessed with the idea of, can we help redirect the speed and the scale and the potential of the Valley towards things like the climate crisis or disease or malnutrition or connectivity, and was talking to everyone I could about that. A lot of entrepreneurs were already on that path. But one thing we heard over and over again was that those entrepreneurs largely had to choose either between impact investors who were values aligned but knew nothing about startups and couldn't help, or Sand Hill Road, which sometimes could help but didn't really care about their mission. And it was just very clear that no one should have to choose between values aligned and value add investors. And this is why we started 50 Years. Started 8 years ago. And we've been backing deep tech founders that are building businesses that have a path to $1 billion a year in revenue and a path to massive positive social or environmental impact ever since.
That's a great overview. Why don't you unpack further how you define deep tech and how that's evolved over time in terms of your investment thesis and scope?
Yeah, we have a very simple definition, which is you probably need a PhD on the team to pull things off. So, it's just companies that are really, really hard to build. These are companies that typically require many years of specialized technical training by at least one of the founders. You can think about technologies in material science or energy or synthetic biology or space technology. They're not the type of startups that a couple of enthusiastic high school seniors could start, right? There's a lot of amazing companies that can be started by enthusiastic high school seniors, but like deep tech companies, not so much.
That's helpful. And one of the things that you've really focused on is the intersection of academia and kind of commercialization. And you have a playbook that you released. Why don't you talk about some of the main principles in that playbook and that you've learned over the years on how to think about commercializing science, or where are some of the misconceptions perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So I think, first it's like, why even care about that? Like, why is that interesting? So, every year in the US, there's $80 billion spent on R&D in research universities. $80 billion. Globally, it's far more than that. Essentially, every single problem the world is facing right now, there is a scientist somewhere in a lab, somewhere that is building a solution. Academia, especially research universities, are the engine of innovation in the United States. But unfortunately, oftentimes those innovations get published in an academic paper, which is the sort of currency of the academic world. And then that's it. Hopefully people read about it, but they don't actually make it out into the world. They don't solve the climate crisis. They don't solve disease. They don't connect the world. They don't increase prosperity. And one of the big reasons that they don't is because the path from academia to entrepreneurship is really, really hard. It's actually significantly harder than being a sophomore college dropout. And there's a few reasons for that. So, one of the reasons is that the culture of academia is very sort of anti-profit. So, I was just at Cambridge University not that long ago, and there are literally labs there at Cambridge University in the UK where if you mention that you are interested, not that you're going to, that you're interested in potentially starting a startup, they will kick you out. Like they'll literally say, there's the door, get the hell out of my lab. Wow. Most universities in the United States, still consider starting a startup a little dirty, a little uncouth, right? It's like, oh, you're selling out. Thankfully, there are some that are really changing. The Church Lab at Harvard is a great example of this, the George Church Lab. But it's still, I would say, a small minority of labs where it's not considered a failure to not stay in academia. Also, the transition from scientist to entrepreneur itself is really hard because a lot of what you learn that makes you a phenomenal researcher makes you a terrible entrepreneur. So just as one example, in academia, you are taught to communicate with data, and then immediately list the 10 ways your data might be wrong. And that's great in academia. That's how you get ahead. If you communicate that way as a founder, people's eyes will glaze over. You will raise no money. You will get no customers. You will hire no talent. And so it turns out there's all this sort of muscle memory that people in academia have to unlearn before they then learn how to be a founder, which you don't have to go through if you're a college dropout. And then finally, when you develop IP at a university, you don't own it. So the inventor of these technologies, with very rare exceptions, there's a couple universities in the world that don't operate this way, but if you invent technology, you don't own it. The university owns it. Because when you joined, you signed an agreement saying anything you invent is owned by the university. And so if you want to start a startup based off of your technology, you essentially have to get permission from your university to access the technology that you invented. And that process, which is called the tech transfer process, is incredibly, incredibly painful. It takes minimum many months. Sometimes it takes years. And then unfortunately, in many cases, the university will force a deal on the founders that makes it impossible for them to actually build a successful startup. So oftentimes, this is more prevalent in Europe than the United States, but it still happens here. You'll see a university that demands 30 to 40% equity of the startup just to let the founders get going. Now, as you know, any company that at founding has 40%, quote unquote, dead weight, meaning 40% of the company is owned by an institution or person that is in no way contributing to its future success, that's a non-starter for a lot of VCs. Sometimes the university will demand a percent of the company's revenues that essentially ensures that company is never going to have positive unit economics, right? Never going to be able to be profitable, right? Which means it's never going to be able to exist. This is rare, but we've seen situations where a university will take 2 of the 3 board seats, which means this company is now functionally controlled by university bureaucrats, not actually the founders in control. And so this process of tech transfer is incredibly broken. Luckily, there's about 7 universities in the United States, and the best universities, best research universities, that have made it kind of tolerable. It's still pretty painful, but what is tolerable? It means the university will likely get somewhere between 1 and 7%, no more. It means that their revenue share will typically be somewhere between 1 and 5%, and they're aware that they don't want to make the company unable to be profitable in the future, and where that process of negotiating with them will likely take no more than 6 months. And of course, that's painful. Imagine 6-month delay in getting access to your IP to actually even start your company. But it's at least possible. Things work. But this what we realize is that this process of spinning out, it's a huge black box. And we were really inspired by a lot of resources that have been put out, prior to the Spinout Playbook. YC has Startup School, which if you're if you're a college dropout looking to start a SaaS startup, is just amazing, right? A bunch of really incredible free resources. Brad Feld published a book called Venture Deals, which if you're negotiating your first equity round, is just an amazing book. Kind of like, it prepares you to negotiate with someone who's done it thousands of times. That resource did not exist for PhDs looking to go through this process of spinning out from the university. And so we built it. We built a Spinout Playbook, 35 pages long. We published it after having 40 conversations with people that had spun out, 10 conversations with ex-tech transfer officers. The X is important there because it means they can actually tell us what's going on. And then, partners at fancy law firms. And so the key that we run people through, the advice we run people through, it's like, when is the right time to spin out? When should you spin out versus continue your research at the university? If you know you want to spin out, what should you do to lay the groundwork when you start your academic career? And then the meat of it is when you're going to the tech transfer officers and trying to get rights to the IP that you invented, like, what are the tips and tricks for doing that well?
Yeah, that's a fascinating overview. To replay it back, first, we need to have a culture change where people at these labs want to build companies. They respect people who build companies. Second, we need to teach people how to build companies, and that's what you're doing with your playbook. And then third, we need to have structural change such that it's easier for people to build companies who want to and are able to. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely nailed it. I mean, it's kind of crazy that we talk to a lot of PhDs that are interested in spinning out, or PhDs not even that are interested in spinning out, PhDs that have invented cool technology. And sometimes we will ask them, so are you thinking about starting a company? And they'll go, me? And they'll go, yeah, you. And they'll go, huh, no one's ever asked me that before. Maybe I should. And it's like, wait a minute, what? And so we at least want it to be the case where a default consideration of an amazing scientist that invents incredible technology is, should I start a company around this, right? It doesn't mean that everyone should. Some people are not meant for entrepreneurship, right? Some people should stay in academia. But it should at least be one of the default paths people consider. Because if it is, a lot of this incredible technology that, again, will solve the climate crisis, will extend our lifespan, will connect the world, will alleviate poverty, will kill malnutrition, a lot more of that technology will actually manifest in a way where we see the goods from it.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Feeling overwhelmed by a jungle of point solutions for your company's spending? Expense management here, corporate cards there, bill pay hiding somewhere else entirely? We've all been there. Introducing Rippling Spend, the game changer that brings everything together into one unified platform. Imagine this: total control over your company's spending in just minutes. Rippling Spend lets you manage expense reports, issue Rippling corporate cards, bill pay, and more. You can say goodbye to the days of juggling multiple logins and scrambling to reconcile accounts. Rippling Spend streamlines the entire process, saving you valuable time and resources. But it's not just about convenience. Rippling Spend also lets you proactively control company spend with highly customizable controls, like auto-approving DoorDash orders under $25 for managers and above, and block transactions that are out of policy at the point of transaction. You can also set custom expense approval chains, instantly issue and revoke corporate cards, eliminate manual transaction reconciliation, all so that you can close your books 3 times faster at the end of the month. Stop wasting time and money on old traditional credit cards and fragmented solutions. Take control and simplify your company's spending with Rippling Spend. Visit rippling.com/spend today for a free demo and 1 month free. rippling.com/spend. This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a B2B SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication, SCIM provisioning, role-based access control, and audit trails. That's where WorkOS comes in, with easy-to-use and flexible APIs that help you ship enterprise features on day one without slowing down your core product development. Today, some of the hottest startups in the world are already powered by WorkOS, including ones you probably know, like Perplexity, Vercel, Jasper, and Webflow. WorkOS also provides a generous free tier of up to 1 million monthly active users for user management, making it the perfect authentication and authorization solution for growing companies. It comes standard with rich features like bot protection, MFA, roles and permissions, and more. If you are currently looking to build SSO for your first enterprise customer, you should consider using WorkOS. Integrate in minutes and start shipping enterprise plans today.
I remember Laura Deming telling me a few years ago, and she has a similar mission, that, hey, what Paul Graham did is he identified young technologists and said, hey, you don't need an MBA to build you don't need a business co-founder necessarily to build a company. You can build it. And she and you and others want PhDs, the same thing. Say more about the differences between building, what's in the Paul Graham playbook and what's in the, what's in your kind of playbook and the advice that you're giving. Like, what are the differences in company building?
Yeah, so I think it's important to say that 85% of what's important in building a startup is actually the same regardless of what you're doing, right? So it's like, how do you hire great people? How do you motivate them? How do you enforce accountability? How do you get press? How do you raise money? How do you close sales, right? How do you hire executives? Like, all of this is the same. It really is. It's just the same. It doesn't matter if you're doing SaaS or consumer tech or deep tech. But there is this sort of 15% that is very, very different and very, very important. And so, with a deep tech company, it's typically, first of all, why is deep tech interesting? Deep tech's interesting because you typically have some significant IP that's generated that leads to very high quality long-term cash flows. So what does that mean, right? What does high quality long-term cash flows means? It means cash flows in the future that are high margin and very defensible. And why are they defensible? It's defensible because you literally hold this IP that means no one else can do it the way you've done it, and you've solved a bunch of really hard technical challenges. And typically in exchange for that, you are giving up short-term revenues. Typically it takes a little bit longer for deep tech companies to generate revenue versus, say, a SaaS company. A SaaS company can generate very quick revenue, but their long-term cash flows might be a little bit less high quality because barriers to entry might be lower. And so there are a lot of trade-offs, for good and for bad when you're building a deep tech company. A lot of them originate around the IP that you're building off of, right? So you typically have some core foundational intellectual property that you first need to get the rights to, but not always entirely, right? So the first thing you need to do is figure out, like, what is my intellectual property moat? What of the things that I've developed already at the university are absolutely essential to what I'm going to build moving forward? What things do I need access to myself, but it would be okay if other people had access to as well, because I already sort of see the next iteration of it that I'm going to develop outside the university? You need to think a lot about the milestones that you're going to hit from a technical point of view, because typically the early rounds, you have less commercial traction, right? So typically prototypical or archetypal deep tech company is such that, if you build it, they will come dynamic, right? Where it's like, hey, this is going to be really hard to build. We might not get there, but if we do build it, it will obviously be a huge winner in the market, right? So classic example is you're able to build a commodity chemical cheaper than anyone else if your technology works, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, sure. If you build that thing that everyone buys and you can sell it for cheaper than anyone else, you're obviously going to win that market. So there's no business model innovation or any of that required. And so what that means is that in the early years, you need to identify all of the technical hurdles that you have yet to overcome, and then sequence them in a way that will allow you to raise successive rounds, right? So you basically need to say, hey, here are the 4 things that are going to be really hard about building what we're building. And here's why we're very certain there's no 5th thing, right? So, which is another way of saying there's no science risk here. There's only engineering risk. We know we can do this, and here are the 4 things that need to get done. And before the next round, we're going to cross off 1 of the 4. And the next round after that, we're going to cross off 2 more of the 4. And then, in our Series B, we'll have crossed off the 4th, and we'll be selling and generating these huge revenues. And so I would say the vast majority of the differences between a deep tech company and a traditional non-deep tech company comes around mapping out your technical milestones and knowing what you're going to hit when. And then, as we talked about a little bit already, the second part comes from taking someone who has a scientist mentality and switching them into a sort of CEO and business person mentality. And this is actually fairly similar to what used to happen in software, right? Like in software, you had the developers who were back then known as the nerds. I'm talking way back when, who would build something people wanted. They would build something people wanted, and then the VCs would come in and they'd say, "Oh, hey, look, the nerds built something people wanted. We're going to hire, Harvard MBA, gray hair to run this company, and they're going to be the CEO." And the nerds never had to think about business. And then at some point, some stubborn nerd was like, "No, I don't want that to happen. I want to run the company." And the VCs were, "Oh, grumble, sure, fine, we'll let you run the company." And then guess what? It turned out that when the nerds learn business, the company works way, way, way better, because it's much easier to teach a deeply innovative person how to business than it is to teach someone who knows how to business how to be deeply innovative. And so we are only recently seeing that transition happen in deep tech. Over the last, except for the last 5 years, the default in deep tech was PhDs created cool thing. Let's hire a CEO, and maybe the PhDs can be employees and the CEO will run the company. there's this renaissance of PhDs that are saying, no, we are willing to put in the work to learn what we need to learn to become great CEOs. And it's this process of shedding their academic traits and then learning to be a great business leader.
That's a great overview, and it's an inspiring note. If we could be as successful in deep tech and bio as we've been, in just straight up technology in terms of teaching tech founders how to business, then you can imagine that, more broadly, this segues to my next question. We're having an AI moment right now. When are we going to have a bio moment, or when are some of the space areas that you invest in going to have kind of their moment? Some of it is more macro stuff. Some of it is the technology there. Some of it is enough founders. How do you think about timing?
I think we're seeing it now. I mean, we have now cured a few diseases that were previously considered incurable via genetic engineering. We are now seeing for the first time synthetic biology companies actually scale up their manufacturing. There's a company in our portfolio called Solugen, which makes carbon negative chemicals using a chemi-enzymatic technology. And they are producing at a 15,000 ton per year plant in Houston right now, as we speak. This is something that 5 years ago, a lot of people were saying we might not see for 20 to 40 years. And so it doesn't capture the imagination of the public quite as much, which, I mean, frankly, for investors like us, is probably pretty great. For the world, not so much. But I think we're already starting to see the fruits of the bioengineering revolution. I mean, literally, we can point to people whose lives were saved because of it. We can't yet do that for AI, right? And so I think over the next 5 to 10 years, it's just going to be absolutely remarkable what we're able to do as new therapeutics come to market, especially when we are able to actually combine, which is happening now, the fruits of LLM research and these incredible new bioengineering techniques. I think we're in the renaissance. We like to say that right now in bioengineering, it's probably 1995, as it was for the internet, right? Like, why did we see this explosion of innovation on the internet in the late 90s? It's because you had these few core infrastructural things put in place, right? You had HTTP figured out, you had FTP figured out, you had the browser built, and then you had, literally like wires run under the ground. And those 4 infrastructural advancements abstracted away a lot of what was really hard about innovating on the internet, and you saw this massive explosion of innovation because the cost and complexity of launching something on the internet, dropped by a couple of orders of magnitude. We've seen that exact thing happen in biology over the last 5 to 10 years. The core infrastructural elements are of course different in synthetic biology. It's read, write, edit, and design. Read is, what do we typically read? The genome, DNA. And if you look at the first human genome that was sequenced, it took 10 years, researchers from 22 universities, and it cost over $3 billion. We can now do that exact thing in 1 day with 0 scientists, and it costs $200. That's like a pretty drastic reduction in cost and complexity. If you look at write, we typically write DNA. You just have to have a bunch of scientists in a lab, looking over the bench, stringing together DNA oligo by oligo. It was a messy process, super expensive. It had length constraints. You can now literally write your DNA in code, click order, and companies will deliver the DNA to your door. And there's a company called Twist that's been doing this for a while. One of our companies, Ansa, just announced that they can do 1,000 MER single-strand DNA, which is just mind-blowing to a lot of people in the field. It's going to enable people to do stuff we never even thought possible before. If you look at edit, again, the previous technique for editing was called talons, super messy, super long, super expensive, and you wouldn't even be sure that you made the edits that you wanted. Thanks to CRISPR-Cas systems, which people have probably heard of, for which the Nobel Prize came out, we can now super easily and accurately edit genomes. It's so easy that high school students are editing yeast genomes with CRISPR kits that their teachers bought online. And then when it comes to design, I think largely because of the advances in computational biology and things like LLMs, a lot of what used to happen in the head of a medicinal chemist can now be done extremely fast, extremely cheaply, and very accurately using computational techniques, which is all to say that the cost and complexity of building in biology has dropped by a couple orders of magnitude over the last 5 years, and we think it's going to continue over the next 10.
If we're in 1995, what's going to get us to 2008, 2009? What's going to be the iPhone moment here that's going to 10x the impact that the big impact that it's already having?
So we talked about when it comes to read, right now we're really good at reading DNA, but there are other omics, right? So there's things like the proteome or the transcriptome or the morpholome. And it really does feel like on the horizon are going to be similar drops in the cost and complexity of reading each of those, but we're not there yet. We definitely need to get there. I think once you see the sort of like Illumina level breakthrough for proteomics, we will see a massive explosion of innovation. We're really excited about that. Two, right now, though DNA writing has been abstracted away, you can only do it for short oligos, so short DNA strands, and then you have to basically piece them all together in the lab if you want to do something long. There's a new way of writing DNA called enzymatic DNA synthesis. So the current way we write DNA is with a technique called phosphoramidite chemistry. Long story short, it's a man-made way of doing it. Every living thing in the world makes DNA using enzymes. And so for sure, enzymes are the right way of doing it. Enzymes should enable us to write, DNA strands thousands and thousands of MERS long. We should be able to write a gene, a chromosome. When we're able to do that, our ability to engineer biology will radically jump forward. There are new editing techniques that are coming that are even better than CRISPR. So CRISPR has a few downsides. It suffers from what are called off-target effects, where every now and then you will make an edit somewhere you didn't want to make the edit. And so once we can even more accurately edit, it's going to be really, really powerful. And then the thing that is happening literally right now, I mean, as we speak, is the application of large language models to biology. And it has been pretty wild. Just as surprising as the advancements we've gotten in, image creation or video creation or, things like ChatGPT, it is wildly surprising how effective they are at helping us engineer biology. Like you can literally just sort of translate DNA sequences, treat them as language, or small molecule structures and treat them as language and throw them at these large language models, and they will help you get to a level of understanding faster and cheaper than ever possible before. So that last one, I think, is like, it's actually happening right now. Maybe, I don't know if I want to say it's already happened, but like it's like this year. And the other ones I think are coming over the next 5 years.
Say more about what that last change will mean for investors in the space. Is it that a set of startups will now be, investable that previously weren't? Is it that, it will kind of diffuse, the benefits will diffuse throughout all the startups in the space? Or how do you, or more incumbents maybe, how do you think about, like, unpack more what this change will mean when it happens?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So I think AI in general is very interesting in that it seems like a large amount of the value, say outside of biology, will accrue to the people that already have large distribution, right? Like the speed of incorporating large language model technology into existing products has been really fast. And so while some of the, model companies I think might benefit, it's unclear to me if the vast majority of the rest of the value is going to go to new startups that are based off of this, or the existing companies that already have distribution that just quickly, insert that technology into what they're doing. For biology, I am much more confident that the majority of the value will come to startups, because the pharma companies historically have never moved as fast at incorporating new technology as like a Facebook or even a Salesforce, right? And over the last 10 years, one of the trends we've seen in that space is that they've sort of functionally almost outsourced their R&D to acquisitions. So they basically wait for a startup to build something cool and they go and acquire it. And that's sort of how they innovate, which means I think that the benefits we're able to get via these large language model advances will go to startups. And a lot of them will be new startups, but a lot of them will be existing startups, because one of the things that we now know when it comes to ML in general is that what you can do, the value you can get from these techniques, is in large part dependent on the quality and the proprietariness of the data sets that you have. And a lot of these bioengineering companies, that is their core innovation. Their core innovation is some way of seeing biology in a way no one else can do. So, we have a company called Digital Biology, for instance, and they've developed a new technique. It's out of the Wyss Institute at Harvard. Essentially, they can, using a photolithography, paint DNA barcodes onto cells in a way that allows them to, in very high throughput, sequence what's going on with full spatial context. So what does that mean? Spatial context, you might have 3 cells, cell A, cell B, cell C. Cell C might be in a disease state, and you want to know why. And it might only be in a disease state because it's next to cell B, which is sending some weird signaling molecule to it. And cell B might only be in that state because cell A, which is next to it, is sending another signaling molecule. And if you don't have that spatial context, cell A is next to cell B is next to cell C, you might have no idea why cell C is in that disease state. And the solution, the therapeutic, might require you to treat cell A, not cell C. And currently, the paradigm is you can either have that spatial context, but in very low throughput, one at a time, which is very slow and expensive, or you can do super high throughput, but you lose the spatial context. You don't realize that they're next to each other. Digital biology for the first time can give you super high throughput and the full spatial context, right? And so they're going to be able to generate a data set that literally no one else has access to, which means they're going to be able to leverage, these advances in ML in a way that other people aren't. And I think that is a dynamic that we're going to see across a lot of these bioengineering companies.
That's a fascinating overview, and it makes me ask, as kind of a side note, you don't have a PhD yourself, right?
No, I didn't even graduate college.
Okay, exactly. How have you educated yourself, and how would you advise others who are fascinated by this revolution but don't have the formal training to get up to speed on it? And where's the best bang for your buck?
So biology is very interesting in that, unlike physics, you can struggle over a paper and understand what's going on as long as you have Google by your side, right? So physics is hard in that there's typically some sort of esoteric mathematics. And if you don't know that math, you're not going to understand that paper. There will literally be alien symbols on the page and you're like, I don't know what that means. And it's not that easy to Google it because what do I even Google? I don't know what that symbol's called. I mean, maybe now with GPT-4 and the multimodal stuff, it'll be easier. But, physics is very, very hard if you don't have deep technical training to even grok what's going on. It's super counterintuitive and really, really difficult. Biology, in a biology paper, the most advanced mathematics you'll typically see is some statistics, right? And it's not that hard to understand statistics. And there will be words you don't understand, but you can just Google those words. And by doing that, you can grok generally what's going on. You can grok what the advancement is, why it's important, what the challenges are ahead. And so for me, I've just read now probably thousands of academic papers. And then, you make notes in the margins of the things you don't understand. And then when you meet the entrepreneurs, they educate you on what's going on. I mean, it's one of the craziest things about being in VC is that every day we're getting educated by the absolutely most brilliant, passionate pioneers of a space who are literally building the future of their fields, right? And because they're entrepreneurs, they typically are slightly better communicators than your average academic. And so my knowledge has literally just come from, all of these incredible conversations with all of these founders that we've had over the years.
Yeah. And you talk to founders who teach you, and then you talk to LPs and you teach them.
Exactly.
Which is a segue to, let's say, we're an prospective LP and we're asking you, hey, could you create kind of almost, and we're commercially motivated or minded. Could you create a market map of how you think about, the 50 years kind of investable scope? What are the things that you're trying to invest in, the opportunities, the subsectors that you think are ready for commercialization now versus ones that, may not be ready or may not be.
We would say, no, we cannot do that, potential LP. So there's a lot of VC funds that are what are called thesis driven. So they basically say, here's how the world's going to, pan out over the next 20 years. And therefore I want 15% of my, portfolio to be in this area of healthcare, and 10% to be in space technology, and 30% to be in this other thing. We are intentionally antithesis. One of our core values as a firm is beginner's mind, right? And why is that? I think it's particularly important if you're a deep tech firm, because the nature of every single fundamental advancement in deep technology is that at some point there were 5 to 10 people in the world that even knew it was possible and therefore saw how the world was going to change because of it. And those were the 5 to 10 people in the lab that just figured it out. And if you're not one of those 5 to 10 people, you're not going to be aware of it. And so the only thing I can guarantee about VCs, sitting somewhere in Silicon Valley, whiteboarding where the world is going, is that they're going to be terribly, terribly wrong. And so we, instead of focusing on being thesis driven, focus on being network driven. That sound familiar, Erik? Network driven. And so what does that mean for us? That means making sure that we are building, resources like the Spinout Playbook, or programs, of which we have several, that are helpful to the researchers and the engineers and the scientists that we think are going to be among that group of 5 to 10, so that when they have that breakthrough, they come and tell us about it. And then to make sure we have the capabilities of doing our own analysis of whether or not we agree with them. One of my favorite books, it's called Profiles of the Future. I actually have it here on the table here. And it's by this guy, Arthur C. Clarke. And it makes, I think, a really compelling case that you cannot predict the future. No matter who you are, VC, scientist, engineer, nobody. And there's just a few examples. So there was this scientist who basically published a piece on rocketry, and he was saying that human spaceflight would be possible. And in 1924, Nature, which is one of the premier scientific publications, it's probably the premier, Nature published a review of it. And the Nature review said, quote, "In these days of unprecedented achievement, one cannot venture to suggest that even Herr Oberth's ambitious scheme may not be realized before the human race is extinct." And then literally 40 years later, everything he was saying happened. Right? So like they were claiming that literally human race might go extinct before it happened, and then boom, 40 years later it happened. There was a guy named Lord Rutherford who helped, maybe more than anyone, elucidate the internal structure of an atom. And people in Lord Rutherford's day, and this is like the 1910, 1915, were starting to talk about harnessing atomic energy, nuclear energy. And he literally like mocked them, like mercilessly, like mocked, like made fun of, basically saying that would just simply never happen. Literally 5 years after he died, we harnessed the first controlled chain reaction. And this was someone who was literally at the forefront of his field. He was responsible for the most recent advancement, and he got it completely wrong. And so I know if these people get it wrong, as VCs, we're going to get it wrong. And therefore, we really focus on just talking to the best and brightest and letting them tell us where the world is going. And then we need to be able to run our own analysis of that.
That's a strong support of the beginner's mind investment philosophy. I definitely agree with you there.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hey all, Erik Torenberg here. I'm hearing more and more that founders want to get profitable and do more with less, especially with engineering. Listen, I love your 30-year-old ex-FANG senior software engineer as much as the next guy, but honestly, I can't afford them anymore. Founders everywhere are trying to turn to global talent, but boy, is it a hassle to do at scale, from sourcing to interviewing to on-the-ground operations and management. That's why I teamed up with Sean Lanahan, who's been building engineering teams in Vietnam at a very high level for over 5 years to help you access global engineering without the headache. Squad, Sean's new company, takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent so you don't have to. With teams across Asia and South America, we can cover you no matter which time zone you operate in. Their engineers follow your process and use your tools. They work with React, Next.js, or your favorite front-end frameworks. And on the back end, they're experts at Node, Python, Java, and anything under the sun. Full disclosure, it's going to cost more than the random person you found on Upwork that's doing 2 hours of work per week but billing you for 40. But you'll get premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost. Our engineers are vetted top 1% talent and actually working hard for you every day. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Head to choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit. One of the things that we were discussing previously is this idea of that you have of the sort of tech bio versus biotech. Talk about that framing and why it kind of required that shift in the first place.
Yeah, so biotech has been an area of VC investment and innovation for a long time. It's largely, I would say, dominated by the Boston area. And recently we've seen innovation in tech bio. So first, what is the difference? And why are we coming up with two different names for something that is essentially aiming towards the same goal, which is curing disease via therapeutics? So a biotech company typically finds a, say, small molecule or a collection of small molecules that it thinks treats Alzheimer's. And the entire company is about validating that hypothesis, that these small molecules treat this disease. And that's it, right? And it's interesting in that there's like a playbook for that. There's not a lot of creative problem solving required. You do your in vitro, then you do your then you do your mouse studies, then you do your phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Even before the in vitro, there's like a playbook on how you go about it, and it either works or it doesn't work. And if it works, it's going to be worth a lot. If it doesn't work, it's very sad. Shut it down. Very recently, there have been entrepreneurs that have the exact same goal, which is we want to treat disease with small molecules or gene therapies or cell therapies or whatever. But they don't start with, we have these things that we think will work. They start with an engine. They start with some computational engine, some high throughput assay that they think will lead to many, many, many such assets over time. And it's interesting in that though the goal is the same, the way you run these companies is radically different, right? The way you should fund these companies is radically different, because with a tech bio company, there is no formula on how you do it. And so creative problem solving is required at every turn, right? And so with biotech, the idea of hire CEO, have them turn the crank sort of works. With tech bio, it doesn't work at all, because when you have to creatively problem solve, no one is better at that than the founder, right? The inventor of the technology. It's also interesting in that it opens up completely new models for monetizing and running the business. For instance, if you in the old biotech model, you do not want to give up your assets until they've manifested their full value, because that's the company. That's it. That is the company, right? So like the idea of taking your asset and selling it and only getting 2% of the value would be absurd, because now your entire company is only going to manifest 2% of the potential value. But for a tech bio company, right, if you really believe you can generate many, many assets over time, well, giving up 2% of the first one, who cares, right? That might be totally fine, because you might have 100 that are going to follow. And so it actually unlocks new ways of running these companies that are very, very interesting. So oftentimes these companies have a technology platform that a Pfizer or Novartis or Genentech would really like access to, because they go, oh man, wow, that's cool. That could let us see biology in a way that might help us develop drugs. And so that company might go, yeah, sure, here, you can have access to it. Give us a couple $100,000 and you can have access to it, right? But only for a couple of months. And then at the end, yeah, it's true that Genentech might discover a drug that makes them $1 billion because that 2-month, $200,000 period. But it's fine, because that's only a little piece of what we can do. And then after that 2 months, you go, hey, did you like that? Cool. Well, guess what? You now, if you want access again, you got to pay us $500,000. And if you find a drug, you got to pay us even more. And Genentech says, oh, fine, sure, we'll do that. And then if that works, you go, oh, well, guess what? Now, if you want access to it, you got to pay us $1 million. If you find a drug, you have to pay us money. And then if that drug makes it to market, you got to give us 1% of the revenue, right? And this is really cool, because this company can be fairly capital efficient, because they're just building technology, right? Whereas if you're building a drug, you have to spend tens and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars pushing it all the way through clinical trials. And then over time, this company can vertically integrate, right? So in the early days, it's just letting other people use the platform. But then maybe 8 years in, it's saying, you know what, other people, you can't use our platform anymore, because we're going to use our platform, right? We're going to take the full upside of all these therapeutics that we make. And it's really nice, because Jeff Bezos has this idea called type 1 and type 2 doors. Type 1 door is a door you can walk through. If you don't like what's on the other side, you just walk back out. Type 2 door is a door you walk through, you don't like, well, it might lock behind you. You might not be able to get back out. And for type 1 doors, he says, forget about it. Just don't think, just go. Walk through the door. If you don't like it, come back out. Bias for action. And for type 2 doors, he says, whoa. You got to slow down. You really got to strategically analyze, because you might not like it over there. It might be really bad. And developing your own drugs is a type 2 door, because in order to know if it's going to work at all, you have to spend at least millions of dollars, sometimes tens of millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. And therefore, you want to kick that can down the road, that type 2 decision down the road, as long as possible. And this is why we really like this new model, where in the early days, companies partner. And yes, they give up the vast majority of the upside of those early things that the platform finds. And then over time, they vertically integrate. Once they have more capital, they have a bigger team, and they've learned all this amazing stuff from all these pharma partners they've worked with.
Yeah, that's a very helpful way of framing it. Talk more about how these companies should think about what platform strategy is most optimal for them.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, one of the most important ingredients to this, which people don't really talk about that much, is just like founder enthusiasm. I know it sounds silly, but the most important scarce resource in any startup is the energy of a founder, right? Literally every other scarce resource, from capital to talent to customers, can be solved so long as the founder energy is high. And so right off the bat, the founder should really think about, like, in what directions would I be most excited to point my platform, and like rank those things very, very, very high. And then you should do customer development. And this looks a lot like customer development in the enterprise SaaS world, right? You pull up a list of like the 55 initial partners that you might have. You create a list of your assumptions. This is what we think those people are going to want, and here's why. And then you call them up and you validate. And you just have calls and calls and calls and calls and calls. We have a company called Manifold Bio, which really turned this into a science. They created this incredible spreadsheet where for every single hypothesis on every single conversation, they marked it from a -2, meaning very negative reaction, to +2, meaning they were very, very interested. 0 was a neutral, which might be even the worst. And then, they would leave it blank if they didn't come up in that conversation. And the first time you go about that, you literally approach it from a point of curiosity. You don't sell your platform at all. You're literally just learning about those customers and their problems and what they care about and how they see the world. And then you take that, you synthesize a little bit, and then maybe you start to formulate some hypothesis around how your platform could add value to them. And then you go back for round 2. And that is 70% learning, but then 30% selling, 30% going, hey, I really think our platform might meet this need of yours. Does that sound right to you? And then you go back and you synthesize again. And then the third time, maybe only then are you 80% selling and then only 20%, listening. And what's really interesting is that in those initial, conversations, if you go to that sort of -2 to +2 sort of framework, the things that are most interesting are the ones where you have a lot of 2s and a lot of -2s, right? So the things where some companies are like, oh my God, that's incredible, I would love to do that. And some are like, that makes absolutely no sense, it's a terrible idea. Those are probably the things you should be focusing on most, because it means that it adds a lot of value and it's probably not a consensus way of going about it. And so we always encourage founders when they're thinking about this to prioritize 1, what do you want to do? Like, what would excite you? And then 2, just do the traditional customer discovery and validate those hypotheses.
Yeah, that's well said. I'm curious how you think about alternative funding models. Zach Weinberg just launched Curie, and then also sort of the DeSci movement more broadly. I'm just curious how you think about, like, how do we better capitalize these companies?
Yeah, and I love Zach just became an LP. I love what he's doing with Curie. We backed a team called Molecule, which is sort of at the forefront of the DeSci movement. So I think we need way more experiments. I think we need way more experiments, because these companies they have to exist, right? These companies are solving incredibly important problems, and they've traditionally been neglected by the VC world. The non-VC world, you've typically either had to go to the sort of government sources or some philanthropists. And there's, I think, a huge opportunity to run a lot of experiments. And so I'm super excited about FROs, focused research organizations, which are sort of quasi-philanthropic, but where the goal is actually to potentially commercialize, to create an endowment. That's a really interesting idea. Very exciting that the UK announced that they're going to put $50 million of UK money behind UK-based FROs. I think that's like incredibly exciting to see something that was a fringe idea and no one was really talking about 3 years ago get support of a major European nation. I think we need to explore models where patient advocacy groups can help translate research that maybe they care about, but other people don't, and then get a percent of the upside if it works. This is something that I think Molecule and what they're doing with the IP NFT is enabling. And then I love, the idea of Curie, which is saying, hey, there's a lot of stuff that you have to do as a biotech company that everyone else has to do. It's really, really expensive to do all that stuff. And so we're going to create a massive team that does that for you. And so that you can just focus sort of on the core science and the business strategy and hiring and all that jazz. So yeah, I think we need more. We need even more. We need more experiments. We're experimenting with a model for funding translational research ourselves. So we call it Manifest Grants. We tested it out in the female reproductive health space, which was a very underfunded area where there's not a lot of companies commercializing because there's not a lot of funding for science that can be commercialized. And so we raised philanthropic capital as a VC fund, create its own separate entity. We got a committee of reviewers together. So we ended up having 40 reviewers. These are sort of experts in the space, a 1.5-page application. And then within 3 weeks, we would get your response of whether or not you get funding. We backed over 14 projects and it worked incredibly well. And so we're now actually going to be launching this for other areas of science. We were inspired predominantly by Fast Grants, which was launched by Patrick Collison and Tyler Cohen during COVID to do this exact thing. And we talked to Patrick, talked to Tyler, and we're literally just took their exact formula and are just now going to roll it out for a bunch of different areas of science so that hopefully we can, and these are no strings attached grants. So we don't take any IP, there's no, deal that we have to be able to back the company. It's just, here's some money, go do great science. And then our goal, hopefully, is that we create enough goodwill such that if these scientists do want to start a company someday, they come and talk to us.
It's fascinating. I've read Patrick, a few years ago, he wrote with Michael Nielsen this idea that science is slowing down on a kind of per capita basis. And one of the reasons he believes is because the funding institution is just far too centralized and we need more diversification of sort of funding sources. And Jose forgetting his last name. He was written about how we should fund people instead of projects sometimes. I say this all as a segue to ask you if you could change anything about how we fund science in the US on a structural level. You could wave a wand. Where do you think would be the best bang for the buck?
So I think I would love to incentivize failure. So right now, the currency of academia, sadly, is publication, right? Like it's what high priority journals do you get published in, and then secondarily, like how many people cite your work, and therefore there's actually an impetus to work on something that you're fairly sure is going to work and that will lead to at least a top 10 publication journal, and that hopefully will be relevant to other people. And it disincentivizes the sort of like really big swings. And so I actually think if I could change something, it would be, I actually think there should be a publication that is of the stature of Nature, Cell, or Science, but you can only get in if you failed, if your research didn't work out. But you had to be just as rigorous in explaining what happened as if it did work out, right? Because actually it's super, super, super relevant. Like a lot of scientists, when another project fails and they go and talk to that scientist, they learn a ton of stuff that then informs their own research. And so I think if you actually had a very high impact journal that only included failures, a lot of them would get cited, right? And it might create this incentive to aim for really, really ambitious things. And if universities and PIs were themselves trying out more ambitious things, I think the funding would follow. So that's actually, it's a little bit tangential to your question, but that's the one thing that I would change.
That's very, very helpful. Mark Andreessen tweeted the other day, he asked, what percentage of published academic research papers are worth anything? Roughly half of the fields are useless, 90% of the research from real fields is marginal at best, and half or more of the remainder doesn't replicate. Do you think there's any truth to that, or is he totally off his rocker? Obviously, he's a smart guy. How do you think about sort of the state of these fields?
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, you have to realize that a lot of what is considered science is it's science in air quotes, right? It's like soft science. The Journal of Metropolitan Sociology, right? Like, I don't know any physicist or biologist that would look at that and go, "Oh yeah, that's science." That it's like not really. But those are considered scientific publications, and those far outnumber Nature, Cell, and Science, and the journals of biotechnology and things like that. So for sure, yes, the vast majority is quite silly and completely impossible to reproduce because it's not real science. It's not hard science. If you took out those and just looked at the sort of the hard sciences, I do still think that his point holds. There's some merit in the point. Again, the vast majority of people are just looking to publish and therefore going for things that they're fairly sure are going to publish. In biology, we have a massive reproducibility problem, which I actually don't believe comes from nefarious reasons. It's just that like the field has not been professionalized. If you go into an academic lab, you will still see people who literally have studied for like 9 years of their lives to be there pipetting, like literally with their hands moving liquid from one place to another, right? And of course, that's a problem because no two people pipette the same way. We have a company called Opentrons, which makes a $4,000 lab pipetting robot. They've grown like wildfire, $2 billion company now. Why is it cool? It's cool because if you run your experiment on Opentrons at Harvard and someone at the University of Tokyo wants to reproduce it, they can download your protocol. And if they have an Opentrons, it will run the exact same way, right? So it helps with the sort of reproducibility problem. So yeah, I agree. If you take the most interesting journals, maybe like the Nature and Cell and Sciences, I think a pretty good percentage of them are very, very interesting and are potentially incredibly impactful. Many of them are not because of the problem we talked about earlier, which is that a lot of this incredible research ends up in that journal and then nothing happens, right? Because there's still a lot of work to manifest it in the world. And the people that are best positioned to do that, the PhDs that invented the technology, are not incentivized to do that and don't think of themselves as potential entrepreneurs. And so I think if we could solve that problem, if we could inspire more PhDs to start more companies, then what Mark said would no longer be the case.
Yeah, I love, this is a perfect place to wrap the interview. In this interview, you've brought some realism about the challenges that we face today, some optimism about, what's on the other side if we're able to solve some of these challenges, but then while also recognizing that we are solving some of them, and then some practical advice on how we can get there. So this has been a very, very complete interview. Seth, thank you so much for coming on. For people who want to learn more about 50 years, what other plugs do you want to leave us with?
Yeah, 50years.com, 50 years on Twitter, and I'm Seth Bannon on Twitter. We're pretty noisy. We share our opinions quite a lot, so give us a follow.
Awesome. I've learned a lot from your content and excited for more to come. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Erik. This was fun.
Turpentine VC is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen and ECON 102. If you like the episode, please leave a review in the Apple Store or rate us on Spotify. Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like ECON 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.